Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Picture this, August 2012, a sweltering day at a platinum mine outside Johannesburg. A group of miners walk off the job. Their demand? Simple. They want their monthly wage bumped from roughly €500 to 1,000. They're not being greedy. They just want a fairer slice of the enormous wealth they're literally digging out of the ground every single day. Meanwhile, the mine's owners are sitting comfortably in London, thousands of miles away. Tensions rise. Then comes the tragedy nobody saw coming. Police fire live rounds into the crowd of striking workers. 34 men never make it home that day. The company's response after this bloodshed? A €75 monthly raise. This isn't just another labor dispute gone wrong. It's a window into a question that's been tearing at the fabric of human society for centuries. Who gets what? How do we divide the rewards of our collective effort between the people who do the work and the people who own the assets? For generations, we've argued about this with more heat than light, more ideology than evidence. Some cynics shrug and say the rich always win and the poor always lose. That's just how the world works. Others promise us that economic growth is a magic elixir that eventually benefits everyone if we just wait long enough. But here's the uncomfortable truth. What if both camps have it completely wrong? What if there's a hidden formula, surprisingly simple yet ruthlessly persistent, that's been driving inequality all along? This question haunted a French economist named Thomas Piketty. He refused to settle for the tired old narratives or convenient half-truths. So he launched an extraordinary mission, a 15-year deep dive through 3 centuries of financial records, spanning more than 20 countries. He transformed himself into a data detective, sifting through forgotten tax documents, inheritance records, and national accounts to expose a pattern that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. The result was Capital in the 21st Century, a book that became an unlikely global sensation. It's thick, it's challenging, but its central insight is startlingly straightforward, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. By the time we're done, you'll understand the elegant formula that's been governing the rise and fall of family fortunes for centuries. A formula so potent it reveals why the past keeps eating the future alive, and what that means for your opportunities, your future, and the world you're navigating right now. This goes way beyond economics. It's the secret blueprint of how our society actually works. Understanding it will permanently rewire how you see everything around you. People have been worrying about how wealth gets divided up for as long as they've been thinking about society at all. Back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, thinkers like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo stared into the future and saw scarcity and conflict everywhere. Their big concern? Land. There's only so much of it, and as populations explode, they figured the landowners, that tiny wealthy elite, would inevitably grab a bigger and bigger piece of everything, leaving scraps for everyone else. Land prices, they warned, would climb to suffocating heights, creating a permanent division between landlords and everyone else scrambling to rent from them. Pretty bleak stuff. Then the Industrial Revolution shook everything up, and the battleground shifted from farmland to factories. Now the anxiety wasn't about the price of land, but about the brutal conditions of industrial workers. In cities like Manchester and Paris, people were grinding away for endless hours, barely earning enough to survive, while factory owners, the capitalists, were piling up fortunes on a scale never seen before. This was the world Karl Marx observed when he sat down to write Capital. He looked at this machine and saw something unstoppable. He called it the principle of infinite accumulation. In Marx's view, capitalism's very DNA programmed it to funnel wealth into fewer and fewer hands, with no natural breaks. Either the capitalists would eventually tear each other apart as profits dried up, or the workers, pushed beyond their breaking point, would rise up and burn it all down. To Marx, capitalism was busily digging its own grave. But then something strange happened. Marx's apocalypse never showed up. Starting in the late 1800s, wages actually began climbing. Workers' purchasing power started improving, slowly at first, then more steadily. The world didn't explode in revolutionary flames. Instead, it rolled into the 20th century. Then, midway through that century, another economist appeared with a story that flipped Marx's script completely. His name was Simon Kuznets. Kuznets told a tale that looked less like an apocalypse and more like a fairy tale. He was the first economist to work with real, long-term data on income inequality, thanks to the relatively new income tax system in the United States. And his numbers told an amazing story. Between 1913 and 1948, inequality in America had dropped like a stone. The slice of income flowing to the top 10% had fallen from nearly half down to around 30 to 35%. Based on this, Kuznets proposed a beautiful optimistic theory that became known as the quote curve. The idea went like this. As countries develop, inequality initially shoots up, but then it naturally and automatically comes back down. Early industrialization is messy and chaotic, benefiting only a lucky few at first. But eventually, as society matures, growth's benefits spread to everyone. The catchphrase of that era summed it up perfectly: a rising tide lifts all boats. For decades, this became the conventional wisdom. It was deeply comforting. It suggested that the market, if we just left it alone, would eventually fix the inequality problem for us. But Thomas Piketty, armed with more data and a longer view of history, uncovered something deeply disturbing. The fairy tale wasn't real. Kuznets himself admitted his theory was mostly speculation. That dramatic drop in inequality he documented wasn't some smooth natural progression. It was the direct result of the most violent, destructive period in modern history. 2 world wars, and the Great Depression, sandwiched between them. These catastrophes didn't lift all boats. They sank the yachts. They obliterated the massive fortunes of Europe's old elite, destroying enormous amounts of capital through physical destruction, runaway inflation, and waves of bankruptcy. The decrease in inequality wasn't a happy developmental milestone. It was a violent reset button. This discovery leads us straight to the beating heart of Piketty's work, the central idea that explains the sweeping arc of wealth and inequality over the past 3 centuries. It's simple, elegant, and devastatingly powerful. It's the inequality. R is greater than G. Let's unpack this, because it's the single most important concept in the entire book. R stands for the rate of return on capital. Think of it as the speed at which money makes more money, all by itself, without you lifting a finger. If you own an apartment building, R is your rental income. If you own stocks, R is your dividends and capital gains. If you've got a savings account, R is the interest. Piketty's historical research shows that the average rate of return on capital, across all its various forms, has been remarkably consistent over time, typically hovering around 4 to 5% per year. Now, G stands for the rate of economic growth. This is how fast the total income and output of society is expanding. It's driven by 2 things: more people being born and workers becoming more productive. This is roughly the speed at which average wages tend to increase. Historically, economic growth has been much lower and more unpredictable than the return on capital. For most of human history, G was basically 0. Even during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, with all that dramatic change, it was only chugging along at about 1 to 1.5% per year. So what happens when R is greater than G? It means that wealth accumulated in the past grows faster than wealth created from current work and production. It means that the fortunes of wealthy families, which consist mostly of capital, will expand more rapidly than the wages earned by ordinary working people. It means that inherited wealth will compound faster than anything you could possibly save from a lifetime of hard work. In other words, the past literally eats the future. This isn't some market glitch or imperfection. It's the logical, internal contradiction baked into capitalism itself. In fact, the more perfectly the capital market functions, the more likely it becomes that R will exceed G. This single inequality, R greater than G, is the engine that drives divergence. It's the fundamental force pushing relentlessly toward an ever-increasing concentration of wealth. Let's look at history through this lens and watch it all make sense. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the world painted by novelists like Jane Austen and Honoré de Balzac decisively crushed G. The return on capital hummed along at around 5%, while economic growth barely crawled forward at 1%. This created what Piketty calls a society of rentiers, a world where inherited wealth was everything. It's the world where, as the cynical character Vautrin coldly explains to the ambitious young Rastignac in Père Goriot, you'd be an absolute fool to pursue a demanding career in law or medicine when you could simply marry a wealthy heiress instead. No matter how brilliantly talented you were, or how brutally hard you worked, you could never achieve the lifestyle that a substantial inheritance delivered instantly, on a silver platter. In this world, wealth concentration reached extreme levels. In France and Britain, around 1910, the top 10% of the population controlled close to 90% of all wealth. The top 1% alone owned over half of everything. Meanwhile, the bottom half of the population owned essentially nothing, less than 5% of the total. There was no meaningful middle class in terms of wealth ownership. There were the very rich, and there was everyone else. This was simply the natural outcome when you had a low-growth society where R exceeded G. Then came the period from 1914 to 1970, the great exception to the rule. 2 world wars destroyed staggering amounts of capital, especially across Europe. But the shocks weren't just physical destruction. Governments, desperate to finance these massive wars, racked up enormous debts and then effectively wiped them out through runaway inflation, which evaporated the savings of the rentier class. After the wars ended, they imposed aggressively progressive taxes on income and inheritance, with top rates in countries like the United States and Britain hitting 80 or even 90%. These policies dramatically hammered down the after-tax rate of return on capital. For the first time in ages, R actually fell. At the exact same moment, economic growth rocketed to unprecedented heights, especially in Europe and Japan, which were rebuilding from devastation and rapidly catching up to the United States. For a few glorious decades, something magical happened. G was actually higher than R. For the first time in recorded history, the inequality was reversed. Labor and merit seemed to win out over inheritance. For the generations born between 1910 and 1960, work genuinely was the most reliable path to success. The share of inherited wealth in the total wealth pool plummeted. Rastignac's cruel dilemma seemed to have been solved. It felt like a fundamentally new, more just world had arrived. But it was an illusion, built on the smoking rubble of war and fueled by exceptional, one-time-only catch-up growth. Since around 1980, we've been living through what Piketty calls the Great Divergence. Economic growth has slowed way down across the wealthy world. The baby boom is ancient history, and productivity growth has settled back to more modest, historically normal levels. Meanwhile, the return on capital has stayed robust and high. And here's the kicker. The tax revolution of the mid-20th century has been systematically dismantled. Top tax rates on income and inheritance have been slashed dramatically, particularly in the United States and Britain. Financial deregulation and globalization created fierce competition between countries desperate to attract capital, triggering a race to the bottom on taxes for profits and dividends. The inequality R greater than G is back, and it's back with a vengeance. We're watching the consequences unfold all around us. The capital-to-income ratio, basically the total stock of wealth relative to the annual flow of income, has been climbing steadily in rich countries since the 1970s. In Europe, it's now approaching the dizzying levels of the Belle Epoque. Wealth is staging a major comeback. But this new inequality wears 2 distinct faces. In the United States, we've witnessed the spectacular rise of the supermanager. American inequality isn't just about capital anymore. It's also driven by an unprecedented explosion of stratospheric incomes from labor. The top 1% in America today is packed with top executives of large corporations, whose compensation packages have rocketed to levels that would have seemed insane just a few decades ago. Piketty argues this isn't because they suddenly became vastly more productive or brilliant. It's because social norms shifted. With lower top tax rates, executives had much stronger incentives to fight for huge raises, and corporate boards, often stuffed with their buddies, were perfectly happy to hand them out. The share of national income flowing to the top 1% in the United States has shot up from around 9% in the 1970s to over 20% today, a concentration level not seen since right before the Great Depression. In Europe, the story unfolds differently. The supermanager phenomenon has been far more modest there. Instead, Europe is witnessing the return of the rentier. With slower demographic growth than the United States, the R greater than G logic operates even more powerfully. The annual flow of inheritance, measured as a percentage of national income, has been steadily climbing. It hasn't quite reached 19th century levels yet, but it's heading in that direction. Piketty's analysis reveals a crucial transformation. The 20th century created something genuinely new, a patrimonial middle class. For the first time ever, the middle 40% of the population managed to accumulate a meaningful share of national wealth, about a third of the total in Europe. This was a major historical innovation, a real break from the past. But this middle class is now getting squeezed from above. The logic of R greater than G means that wealth is once again concentrating at the very top. What does the future hold? Piketty's projections are pretty sobering. As global growth inevitably slows down in the 21st century, once emerging economies like China and India finish their catch-up phase, the inequality R greater than G will become the dominant global reality. This gets amplified by another disturbing fact. The rate of return on capital is itself unequal. The extremely wealthy don't just have more capital, they actually get a higher return on it. Piketty demonstrates this brilliantly with data from university endowments. The largest endowments, like Harvard's and Yale's, consistently earn much higher returns, around 10%, compared to smaller endowments, pulling in around 6%. Why? Because they can afford the absolute best financial advisors and can access sophisticated, high-yield investments that are completely out of reach for smaller investors. The exact same pattern holds for individual fortunes. Once you cross a certain wealth threshold, your money starts working dramatically harder for you. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. The wealthy earn a higher R, so their wealth grows faster. As their wealth grows, they gain access to even better returns, and the cycle accelerates. It's a powerful engine of divergence, a force relentlessly pushing toward an oligarchic future where a microscopic minority owns a vast and ever-expanding share of the world's wealth. So are we doomed to slide back into a 19th century world of extreme inequality where merit and effort matter less than the lottery of birth? Piketty argues it's not inevitable, but avoiding that future requires us to fundamentally reinvent the tools of democracy for a globalized world. The forces of R greater than G are powerful, but they're not laws of physics. They can be regulated and controlled. His primary proposal is bold, a progressive global tax on capital. This isn't about punishing success or abolishing private property. It's about transparency and sensible regulation. The first step would be creating a global financial registry, essentially knowing who owns what everywhere in the world. This would make it vastly harder to dodge taxes through shady tax havens, and would give us a crystal clear picture of the true state of global wealth. The tax itself could start at very modest rates, maybe just 0.1% on smaller fortunes, rising to 1 or 2% on larger ones, and perhaps climbing higher on multi-billion-dollar fortunes. The primary goal isn't raising massive revenue, but rather curbing the endless upward spiral of wealth concentration. It's a mechanism to ensure that R doesn't get too ridiculously far ahead of G, preventing the past from completely devouring the future. Piketty freely admits this is a utopian idea. it would require an unprecedented level of international cooperation and coordination. But he frames it as a useful utopia, a benchmark we can use to measure other, more realistic policies against. And he issues a stark warning: the alternative might be far uglier, a retreat into nationalism, protectionism, and crude capital controls, blunt instruments that would damage the global economy without actually solving the underlying problem of runaway inequality. In the end, Piketty's message splits the difference between Marxist doom and Kuznets's cheerful optimism. It's a call to democratic action. The market economy doesn't exist in some natural vacuum. It's a social construction, shaped and molded by the political choices we collectively make. The history of the 20th century proves we can, when circumstances force our hand, profoundly transform how wealth is distributed. The challenge of the 21st century is doing it again, but this time not through war and destruction, but through peaceful, informed, democratic deliberation. So what do we actually take away from this monumental tour through the history of wealth and inequality? The most powerful, and perhaps most unsettling lesson is this: capitalism, left entirely to its own devices, has a natural, built-in tendency to generate unsustainable levels of inequality. The comforting idea that economic growth alone will magically fix the problem, that a rising tide automatically lifts all boats, is a myth the historical data simply doesn't support. The great compression of inequality in the 20th century wasn't the result of some gentle, harmonious, natural progression. It was the violent product of war, revolution, and economic crisis, a chaotic and brutal reset. This matters profoundly right now, because we're living in a world where all the conditions for a new Gilded Age are quietly falling into place. Growth is slowing across the developed world. The return on capital remains strong and steady. And the political will to impose progressive taxes on wealth and inheritance is evaporating in the face of global tax competition. Piketty's formula, greater than G, isn't some dusty historical footnote. It's a description of the exact world we're navigating right this minute. You can feel its effects rippling through your own life. It's there in the insane cost of housing in major cities, which enriches property owners while slamming the door on young people trying to get started. It's in the skyrocketing cost of higher education, increasingly becoming a luxury item accessible only to families who can afford the sticker price. It's in that nagging, uncomfortable feeling that the game is rigged in favor of people who already have wealth. But Piketty's book isn't a prophecy of inevitable doom. It's a work of history. And history's fundamental lesson is that the future isn't predetermined or locked in. It emerges from the choices we make, individually and collectively. His work is fundamentally a call for a more honest, informed, democratic conversation about the world we want to create. So what can you actually do with all this? Here are a few straightforward, practical thoughts to carry with you. First, train yourself to distinguish between income and wealth. We live in a culture that obsesses over income, salaries, wages, bonuses, raises. But the real driver of long-term inequality is wealth, the accumulated stock of assets that generates income automatically, year after year. Understanding this distinction is your first step toward seeing the world through Piketty's eyes. Pay attention not just to how much people earn, but to how much they own. Second, think strategically about the sources of your own future prosperity. Your skills, education, and hard work will generate your labor income, which will grow roughly at the rate of G. But R greater than G tells us that building real, lasting, multi-generational wealth requires more than just a solid salary. It requires saving and investing, transforming your labor income into capital that can start working independently for you. This isn't about becoming some ruthless robber baron. It's about understanding the system you're operating within and using its own internal logic to build genuine security and freedom for yourself and your family. And third, most importantly, engage actively in the democratic conversation. The level of inequality in society isn't some technical issue best left to experts. It's fundamentally a political question. Taxes, social policies, financial regulations. These aren't boring subjects fit only for economists and politicians. They're the actual tools we have to shape the kind of society we want to inhabit. They're the levers we can pull to ensure capitalism's benefits are shared more broadly, and that the engine of R greater than G doesn't spin completely out of control. That brings us to the end of our journey through capital in the 21st century. We've explored the grand sweep of history, from Marx's apocalyptic warnings to Kuznets's optimistic promises, landing finally on Piketty's powerful insight. But a conversation like this is just the map. The book itself is the territory. The real discoveries happen when you're reading, and a sentence or data point suddenly clicks, connecting the dots of history to the world unfolding right in front of your eyes. This summary is my invitation to you. If any of these ideas have sparked your curiosity or challenged your assumptions, I genuinely hope you'll pick up a copy and dive in. Reading it isn't just about learning economics. It's about understanding the deep structural forces that will shape your future and your children's future. The link is waiting for you in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps me know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another transformative book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing and learning together.